everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the first webinar of the Fall 2025 series presented by Newton Conservators. We're really thrilled to be starting our 6th year of doing these webinars and are glad you're here to join us. My name's Beth Wilkinson, and I'll be the moderator of this virtual event this evening. And we're very fortunate to have Barbara Bates as our experienced technical director. As most of you know, Newton Conservators is an all-volunteer nonprofit established in 1961. We are grateful for the beauty and sustenance that the land provides for humans and the other creatures with whom we share this earth. Our goals of preserving open space and connecting people to nature require challenging the ways in which land conservation has historically excluded some peoples from protected land. Newton Conservators commits to acknowledging this exclusionary history and to building active partnerships with groups who've been hurt by that history, starting but not ending with Indigenous peoples such as the Massachusetts. As naturalist Aldo Leopold wrote, "When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." Phenology is the timing of events in nature. As a result of a warming climate, plants and animals are now active earlier in the spring and are extending their activities later into the autumn. We are really fortunate to be here in New England to observe the really iconic and exciting examples of phenology. And we can really appreciate them because we have an abundance of historical sources, extensive weather records, and a rapidly changing climate. We're not so fortunate about that part. But Richard's going to tie all of that together for us. He's going to describe the state of phenology research in Massachusetts and elsewhere, and show how everyone can contribute to this exciting field. Richard's professor of plant ecology at Boston University and a lifelong Newton resident. For 50 years, he and his students have carried out phenological observations in the Boston area, including Concord and the Arnold Arboretum. He's also the author of widely used textbooks in conservation biology and the author of the popular book, Walden Warming: Climate Change Comes to Thoreau's Woods. We are very fortunate to have Professor Primack here to share his insights about phenology in our region. Welcome, Richard.
I would like to thank the Newton Conservators for inviting me to come here, and thanks for all of your great work protecting the lands of Newton and protecting conservation and having many programs like these. As Beth mentioned, I'm a lifelong Newton resident and also a plant ecologist. My undergraduate thesis was a flora of what was then called the Hammond Woods and now maybe is often called the Webster Woods. And this flora has been changing over time. And even when I began this study many years ago, I recognized that it was a changing flora. Also, a lot of the insights which I've got studying biology in Newton and later on I put into a textbook, which is the Essentials of Conservation Biology. And beginning about 25 years ago, especially, I recognized that we needed examples of climate change research from the New England region, that most of the examples of climate change were from faraway places. And so beginning 25 years ago, I changed the focus of my research from tropical ecology to looking at phenology. And phenology, as Beth mentioned, is the timing of biological events. And it is the most sensitive indicator of climate change. So our climate in New England and really throughout the world is changing. And as a result of it, biological species are responding to these changes in many ways. And I will talk about various types of changes, but of all of them, the timing of events is the most sensitive to climate change. And people have been studying phenology for well over 1,000 years. So there are many examples where people have kept very detailed records of when plants are flowering, when fruits like grapes mature in the summer, when lakes melt in the spring. And people have kept track of these things for mostly agricultural purposes or just to make sure that their festivals are on the right date. And now it turns out that these records of the timing of events have proved to be a very sensitive indicator of climate change. And climate is really changing throughout the world, but it's changing particularly strongly in Boston. And we also have particularly good records of climate change in the Boston area because of the Blue Hills Observatory, which is the longest continuously running weather station in the United States. And so at the Blue Hills Observatory in Milton, Massachusetts, there is a weather station which has been running since about 1890. And then there are earlier records that have been kept locally by farmers. And of all of the features of climate change, the one which is the most strong is the warming effect of climate change. So the temperatures really throughout the world have gotten about 1 degree centigrade or about 2 degrees Fahrenheit warming. But in the Boston area, we have about 2 degrees centigrade or about 4 degrees Fahrenheit warming over the last 100 years or so. But one thing which is also a unique feature about New England, which we all know, is that not only do we have a warming trend, but we have extremely variable weather from year to year. And this is something that we'll come back to later. So we not only have a warming trend, but we also have cold years and warm years which juxtapose. But as you see from the 30-year running average shown in red in this figure, is that the overall trend is toward warming. Besides a warming climate, climate change also is changing rainfall patterns. And the general rule of climate change is that wet places are getting wetter and the dry places are getting drier. And so New England is a wet place and it's been getting wetter over the last 50 years. But also, the rain is coming down differently than it did before. So we now have extremely heavy deluge, like we're expecting to have over the next couple of days when the big nor'easter hits us, but also periods of dry weather, so periods of drought, alternating with these periods of very heavy downpour. Another feature of climate change, which I won't talk much about today, is sea levels rising. So as a result of the melting of the polar ice caps and the warming of the ocean, sea levels are rising, and we've already had about 1 foot of sea level rise in the New England region over the last 100 years. And then also another feature of climate change is the fact that the carbon dioxide levels are rising. So carbon dioxide levels rising are the thing which is driving climate change by trapping more heat close to the Earth's surface, but also plants need carbon dioxide for their growth. So with CO2 rising, some plants are going to do better and some plants will do worse. So we all have direct personal experience of how climate change is affecting the climate of New England. And one particular feature that we often note is that the ice doesn't form as thickly on the ponds or the um, lakes over the wintertime. So ice skating is something which we often are not able to do, which we used to do decades ago or half a century ago. So places like Walden Pond, which used to have really thick ice on it, and people would cut the ice commercially, often doesn't freeze during the wintertime because of climate change. And then corresponding, we often have heat waves during the summer in ways which we didn't experience before. When I grew up in Newton, people said you didn't really need air conditioning in the Boston area. And now having air conditioning is really much more comfortable during heat waves during July and August. So we note also that plants are changing in the Boston area, and we know this in part because of the plants that people can grow. So when I was growing up, figs were pretty rare in Newton and around Boston. People didn't grow them very much, and mostly you had to grow them in pots and take them in during the wintertime. And that's probably still the best way to grow figs in Newton, but you can also grow figs just outside, unprotected, and in many years they'll survive through the winter without any protection at all. And that's something that definitely wasn't true recently, in recent years. And another indication of things that are changing is people are starting to grow plants which are much more southern. They're still experimenting with them. So plants like the crepe myrtle shown below, or plants like camellia, are really pretty iffy in the Boston area, but people are experimenting with them, and then probably within 10 or 20 years, you'll be able to grow camellias and maybe even crepe myrtle in the Boston area, and they will survive. And climate change, just to kind of emphasize, climate change is really an existential threat in the world. So as biologists, we're looking at the effects on phenology, but phenology is really an indicator of something much more serious, which is threats to almost the very existence of humanity. This is a picture showing the effects of climate change on world agriculture predicted in 25 years from now. And the areas shown in red are areas which are predicted to have between a 20 to 50% decline in agricultural productivity 25 years from now. And you can see that many areas of the world, like Brazil, India, Southeast Asia, areas of Africa, places where there are billions of people living, are places where agriculture might radically decline or even fail because of high temperatures and drought in coming decades. And another kind of example of an existential threat is that with polar ice caps melting and also the sea warming up and expanding because of the rising temperature, that sea levels will be much higher. And this is a picture showing what Boston will look like several decades from now if it gets hit by a major hurricane like Hurricane Sandy at high tide. And it just shows you that most of Boston will be underwater, or large areas of Boston will be underwater. The star, by the way, is where Boston University is, and then you can see where the word Boston is where Beacon Hill is, and you can see that everything between Kenmore Square and Beacon Hill, areas north of there, south of there, areas of South Boston, Back Bay, will all be under 3 to 6 feet of water um, if Boston gets hit by a hurricane. So climate change is a very real threat. So what we began doing 25 years ago was investigating how the diversity of plants and animals in the Boston area would be affected by climate change. We should care about this because we care about rare plants and animals being lost by climate change. But we also care because a rising climate means potentially heat waves that are affecting people. It means flooding of coastal areas. And so we wanted to see whether we could see the fingerprint of climate change already on the flora and the fauna of this area. And then also 25 years ago, we deliberately decided that whatever we found out, we would try to publicize the results and try to see if we could change people's mind about the reality of climate change. So there are three key indicators of climate change that we find in natural systems. And by far the most important, as I've already mentioned, is phenology, the timing of events, really throughout the year, but especially in the spring. But climate change will also affect the distribution of species. So, for example, it will allow birds to fly further north and to take advantage of a warming climate. And it also affects the abundance of species. So some species will do better with a warming climate, and other species won't do so well. And so by looking at shifting abundance of species, you might also see the fingerprint of climate change. And the key approach is to find old records and then to match these old records against modern records and to see if there's any change. And as Beth mentioned, New England is really unique in the United States, that once we started looking for these old records 25 years ago, we found a tremendous abundance of these kinds of records in New England in a way which is not available elsewhere in the United States or really elsewhere in the world, except maybe certain small areas of Western Europe. So this is a really unique feature of this region. So we found old records of when plants were flowering, when birds were migrating, the abundance of species. And by matching these old records with modern records that we made ourselves or that we asked others to make, we started to see the fingerprint of climate change. And of all of the records that we found, the records that were the most valuable were the records kept by Henry David Thoreau, who was the author, of course, of the book Walden and the essay Civil Disobedience. And during the 1850s, Henry David Thoreau, the famous environmental philosopher who lived on the edge of Walden Pond, kept detailed records of when plants were flowering in Concord, Massachusetts. For more than 300 plant species, for 8 years, he recorded when they were flowering. And Thoreau, of course, is a philosopher who lived more than 170 years ago. But he's still someone who's very influential in the United States because of his views of simple living and politics and society. And Thoreau is also very quotable. So Thoreau says things in his writing like, wilderness is the preservation of the world. Great. And Thoreau says, it's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. Great. So Thoreau is really an amazing person. And Thoreau kept very detailed journals, as I've mentioned, during the 1850s of flowering time. And Thoreau was a really funny writer, so many people think he was a very serious guy, but he was actually a very funny guy. His book, Walden, is full of jokes and funny stories. And Thoreau liked to make up words, and one word that he made is the word relometer. And a relometer is an instrument for measuring reality. And so what we were able to do was to take Thoreau's records of phenology from Concord, Massachusetts, and use that as a relometer for measuring the reality of climate change. And so this is a picture of Thoreau's journal from the 1850s. So this is actually a page from his journal of May 1857. And the numbers here, like 13 and 14, represent days in May when he first saw plants in flower. And his writing is in black, my writing is in blue. And Thoreau notoriously had bad handwriting. His bad handwriting was very hard to read. He started off using common names, and then at some point he switched over to scientific names. He often abbreviated names. So you can see, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor here, but like this is V. vacillans, which stands for Vaccinium vacillans or low bush blueberry. So it took us about 2 years to actually figure out all of his names. A lot of his names were very obscure. They were hard to read. But again, he was recording things like high blueberry, or what we would now call high bush blueberry. And the high bush blueberry is still a very common plant in Concord today. And so what we began to do in 2004 was we started to go out to Concord, Massachusetts, and record the phenology of wildflowers around Walden Pond and elsewhere in Concord, just the same way that Thoreau did. So we recorded the bird's foot violet, the first flowering of bird's foot violet, the first flowering of lady slipper orchids. And I should also just emphasize here that Thoreau was recording the first open flower of a certain species that he saw in Concord during any particular season. And we started to do the same thing also, recording not the peak flowering, not any time we saw the plant in flower, but the first day we saw the plant in flower in Concord. We were also extremely lucky because after we started our study, we discovered that there was another botanist who lived in Concord named Alfred Hosmer, who knew Thoreau, who started to make these same observations from 1878 to 1902 in Concord. So we had Thoreau's observations and Hosmer's observations. And this is a picture just showing the results of our research combined with the results of Thoreau and Hosmer. So this is a figure showing from dates from 1851 through to the present time. Each one of these symbols represents a year of field work, the average flowering time of 30 common wildflower species that Thoreau, Hosmer, and we saw in every year. So each dot represents a year of field work, and you realize there's a lot of work in terms of making up this figure right here. And on the y-axis, these are dates in May when these 30 plants each season have their average flowering time. And so we can see we have these years of Thoreau, the 8 years of Thoreau, which are shown as red dots. And then the cross symbol, the plus symbol, represents the average of Thoreau's years. So it tells us that on average, the plants were flowering around May 16th across Thoreau's years, even though there's a lot of variation among years. And then we have Hosmer's years, again, a lot of variation, but on average, the plants are flowering around May 10th. And then we have our years, again, a lot of variation in our years, but the plants are flowering around May 6th. So what we can see is that the plants of Concord, Massachusetts have shifted by 10 days in terms of their flowering time. And we think that this is because of climate change. And every time we've done another couple of years of field work, we've written a scientific paper, we always write press releases, we send the press releases to major newspapers and media outlets. And this story of how climate change is causing the plants of Concord, Massachusetts to shift has actually been repeatedly covered in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, because it's an iconic study showing how climate change is affecting flowering time, and it connects to Thoreau and Walden Pond. So what is driving this change? What is absolutely driving this change is temperature. So these are the same years of data, but instead of looking at changes over time, it's showing each year's flowering time in relationship to spring temperature. So on the x-axis, we have spring temperature. On the left side, it's a very cold spring. On the right, it's a very warm spring. And what you can see is that the years fall along a line, that basically the colder it gets, the earlier the plants flower in spring. And it's a very tight, highly significant relationship. So cold springs, the plants flower late. Warm springs, they flower very early. And the red dots shown here are the observation years that we've made. And they tend to be in the warm area. So basically, the reason that plants are flowering earlier over time is not because time is going by, but because the climate is getting warmer and the plants are responding to that. We've also been looking at the effects of climate change in other locations in the Boston area. And one place which we spent a lot of time looking is at the Arnold Arboretum. And at the Arnold Arboretum, we started going out about 10 years ago, and actually more like 15 years ago, recording the flowering time of plants at the Arnold Arboretum. And we recorded the flowering time for several years, and then we found out that they actually had a large museum associated with the Arnold Arboretum where they had museum specimens of plants collected on the grounds of the Arnold Arboretum. So they have these kinds of museum specimens, which are called herbarium specimens. And these are specimens which are collected on the grounds of the Arnold Arboretum. And they're collected on the grounds of the Arnold Arboretum. And they also have labels on them which say the date they were collected and the number of the plant they were collected from. And so this plant right here, this specimen right here, was collected from this flowering plant of the Vaseis azalea. And this specimen was collected on May 19th, 1938. And this photograph was taken on May 3rd, 2010. And so what we were able to do is by matching herbarium specimens collected in full flower in the past with when the same exact individual is flowering at the Arnold Arboretum over the past years, we were able to again demonstrate with just a couple of years of data that plants are now flowering about 10 days to 2 weeks earlier at the Arnold Arboretum than they did in the past. So this was actually a method that we first developed at the Arnold Arboretum and that is now really widely used across the United States and across the world of people taking old herbarium specimens and matching them with modern observations. So again, something that we learned to do in New England and now very widespread around the world. Another technique that we developed at the Arnold Arboretum was matching photographs, dated photographs for looking at the effects of climate change. So at the Arnold Arboretum, they have enormous collections of photographs taken over the last 130 years that are all very well preserved at the Arnold Arboretum. And so by matching photographs of plants taken in full flower at the Arnold Arboretum, or I should say dated photographs, we were able to show that plants flower earlier in warm years and later in cold years, and they've been flowering earlier over time. And this is just one example of the American fringe tree. And you can see there's an old photograph taken on June 20th, 1926, and we have the same species flowering in a more recent year on May 7th, 2003. And you would never find a fringe tree flowering in the middle of June at presently. It's just the conditions are just much warmer. So we can again use these dated photographs to see the effects of climate change on the phenology of species. And then another really neat example of dated photographs is that we found a person who kept a collection of dated stereoscopic photographs, so paired photographs that give stereoscopic images, taken on Memorial Day at historically important cemeteries. And this woman who kept this collection told us that she had one set of photographs that looked really strange, a really strange set of photographs taken on Memorial Day, and she just wanted our opinion about what was so strange about it. And so she showed us this photograph taken on May 30th, 1868 at the Lowell Cemetery, so kind of on the northeastern part of Massachusetts. And so this is a photograph taken on May 30th, 1868, and it's a really strange photograph because the trees don't have any leaves. Very, very odd. And when we actually looked at the weather records, we found out that 1868 was a year with no spring. It was a year in which the weather was so cold and that there were frosts all through March, April, May, and even into early June, that these trees either never leafed out at all because it was so cold, or they might have leafed out and then the leaves were killed by a late frost. And the picture on the right is just as you would expect. It's the way the cemetery looks in a more typical year. This is a case on May 30th, 2005. So we've also been looking at the leafing out time of trees, the phenology of tree leaf out, mostly in Concord, Massachusetts, but also at the Arnold Arboretum. And the observations in Concord tell us something very interesting, which is that trees are extremely sensitive to climate change, and they're actually more responsive to climate change than the wildflowers. So the trees in Concord are now leafing out about 14 days earlier than they did during Thoreau's time, in contrast to about 10 days for the wildflowers. So kind of a different sensitivity of trees than wildflowers. And we've been developing some very interesting experimental techniques to look at the effects of climate change on the leafing out time of trees and shrubs. And this is a method, again, that we pioneered at Boston University and written about. And this method consists of collecting twigs in the spring or in the late winter or early spring before the trees have leafed out. So you collect twigs and you bring them inside and you put them in conditions of different temperatures and different lighting, and you see what the impact is on climate change. And this is a very powerful technique for seeing how plants know when to leaf out, see how trees are able to sense the right time to leaf out when the winter is over and when the spring has begun. And one approach that we've taken, which has proved to be very interesting, is that you can take twigs in the late winter or spring, and you can bring them inside and expose them to very different temperatures, and you can see their sensitivity to spring temperature. So in this case, these are crabapple twigs that have been brought into different temperature conditions that we have at Boston University. And these show temperature conditions that they've been experiencing in degrees centigrade. So just for those of you who are not used to centigrade temperatures, so 4 degrees centigrade is about the temperature of a refrigerator. So it's very cold conditions, refrigerator temperatures. And 21.5 degrees centigrade is room temperature. And 25 degrees centigrade is a very warm room, a very uncomfortably warm room. And so we have a gradation of temperatures here. And you can see that plants which have been exposed to these for about 2 weeks have really responded to these temperatures very strongly. So twigs exposed to cold temperatures, for example, a persisting winter, for example, still are not leafing out, they're still remaining dormant, and that as the conditions get progressively warmer, that the twigs have responded by increasing development. And so by, for example, when it's 25.5 degrees, the twigs are very highly developed and already have open flowers. So we can see using these very simple experimental techniques how trees are responding to a warming climate. And so we've proposed this is a technique which would be very suitable for undergraduate courses, for homeschooling groups, for high schools, to investigate climate change experimentally. Uh, Again, herbarium specimens are a very powerful way to look at climate change. And in our studies in Concord, we found that trees were more sensitive to climate change than wildflowers. And we were curious if this was happening not only in Concord, but really across Eastern North America. And so we used herbarium specimens, which we can use to see when trees are leafing out. So in case of many trees, they often have young trees when they flower, so botanists often make herbarium specimens with both flowers and young leaves on them. And so we found herbarium specimens from all across Eastern North America of when trees had young leaves and also when wildflowers were flowering all across Eastern North America for about 6 species of each. And then we found using these specimens, looking at plants growing in different climates and different years, the trees were again more sensitive to climate change than were wildflowers all across Eastern North America. So what we found in Concord or in New England was proved using this very, very wide set of specimens. We got colleagues from Europe and from Asia to do the same thing with common trees and common wildflowers in their regions. And that pattern did not occur in Asia or Europe. So this is primarily a phenomenon of Eastern North America. We also found something very curious when we did the study, which was that trees and wildflowers are much more responsive to temperature in Eastern North America than they are in Asia or Europe, suggesting that trees there might be responding to other cues, like maybe day length, more strongly than spring temperature. We've also been working with lots of ornithologists from all over New England, looking at the effects of climate change on bird migration times, so the phenology of bird migration in the spring. And we've been working especially with colleagues from the Manomet Bird Observatory in Plymouth, Massachusetts, but also other locations, Concord, Massachusetts, Middleborough, Massachusetts, and also ornithologists at the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge and Arlington. And what all of these studies show is that birds are responding to climate change, but much more weakly than trees and wildflowers. And you can look at this graphically in the following way. So this is the same kind of data we've been showing before. So we have spring temperature on the x-axis and when things happen on the y-axis. And what you can see is that the trees, which are shown in green here, the leafing out date of the trees, has a very steep response to temperature. So trees are very responsive to temperature. Wildflowers, shown in red, are intermediate in their response to temperature, and birds, shown in blue here, bird arrival time in the spring, it's responding to climate change. Birds are getting a little bit earlier with warming temperatures, but the response is much more weak than trees and wildflowers, suggesting the possibility of what is sometimes called the phenological mismatch between trees and or between plants and birds, suggesting that maybe in the future that birds might not do as well because they're misaligned with other aspects of the biological system. And the connecting link between birds and plants are insects. When birds arrive in the spring, they're mostly feeding on insects. And when insects emerge in the spring, they're mostly feeding on plants. And so for a long time, we were searching for phenological data about insects. And that, in contrast to birds and plants, is surprisingly hard to find. It's really tough to find anyone who's really carefully monitoring when you see insects in the spring. And eventually we found that we could use butterfly data from the Massachusetts Butterfly Club to determine that insects, especially butterflies, were very responsive to climate, and that also there's a group of people working with museum specimens of bees, again finding that bees are very responsive to climate change. And this again indicates it's really birds that are really out of line in terms of their sensitivity to a warming climate. Also in Concord, we spent a lot of time looking for plants to measure phenology. And surprisingly, in Concord, we had trouble finding a lot of the wildflower species that Thoreau and other people had seen in Concord in the past. And we eventually, as part of our phenological observations, we eventually just published a study just saying that a lot of the plants that had been studied in the past for phenology, we couldn't find in Concord. About 27% of the wildflower species that Thoreau and Hosmer and others have seen in Concord, we couldn't find at all despite years of searching and are presumably locally extinct. They're present elsewhere in New England, but just not in Concord anymore. A lot of this loss of wildflower species is due to things like habitat destruction, deer, invasive species. But we know that at least some of this loss of wildflower species is due to climate change. And we know this because of two reasons. One is because the species which are the least sensitive to climate change in terms of their phenology tends to be the ones which have declined and gone locally extinct. So phenological sensitivity is not only an interesting biological indicator of climate change, but it's also a characteristic of, it's also helps us to predict which species will persist in Concord and which species will go extinct. And we also know that climate change is causing a lot of species extinction because species are often going extinct at the southern edge of their range in New England. So when species are really kind of cold-loving northern species, which reach their southern distribution in Massachusetts or Connecticut, that's where they're tending to decline the most, and they're not tending to decline at the colder northern edge of their range. And I should also mention that butterflies and birds are also changing because of climate change. A lot of southern species which used to be found south of Massachusetts, are now extending their range northward into Massachusetts. And the climate of New England will continue to change, and the phenology will continue to change. So the figure on the left just shows predictions of future climate change in the United States or in the world. And you can see that there are two scenarios. One scenario, if we really take climate change very seriously and we implement a lot of climate change measures, we might get away with only having 2 degrees centigrade increase in temperature by the end of this century. But it's more likely we're on track to about a 3 degrees centigrade increase by the end of the century. And what does that mean for the climate of Massachusetts? And you could say also for the phenology of the species. And the figure on the right shows the effects of climate change on the climate of Massachusetts. And Massachusetts no longer has a climate like Massachusetts. So Massachusetts currently has a climate like New Jersey had when I was growing up. So we presently in New England, you could say we have a New Jersey climate, which is warmer than it used to be. And it's predicted by the end of this century that Massachusetts will have a climate more like North Carolina did when I was growing up. And I lived for 4 years in North Carolina, and I just remember avoiding going out during the day because it was so hot during the middle of the day. And I also remember lying in bed in my un-air conditioned house and just feeling really hot and sweaty and having trouble sleeping. And that's what Massachusetts will potentially be like by the end of this century. So mostly I've been talking about the effects of climate change on the phenology in the spring, but phenology will be affecting other times of the year also, most particularly in autumn. So we will have climate change effects throughout the year, so much hotter summers. We will have uh, much more mild winters with less snow on the ground. But phenology will very strongly affect the autumn. And we're seeing that right now. So we've had a very mild autumn so far, a relatively warm and mild autumn. And as a result of that, the trees mostly still have green leaves on them, and the trees really haven't started changing color that extensively yet. And this is again effective climate change, that trees are responding to warming temperatures by just holding their leaves longer in the autumn. Also, many insects are still very active. So in our garden today, I was observing lots of different kinds of bees and wasps and flies visiting tomato flowers and squash flowers and pea flowers in our garden. So the insects are still active. They're not going dormant yet because the climate is still warm and there's still plants in flower. And also, many bird species are staying longer in New England than they did in the past because of the mild conditions, the availability of insects to eat, and the extensive availability of fruit which they can feed on. And so, many bird species are staying longer before starting their fall migration. So, this is just describing how a plant ecologist investigates phenology and just the indicators that you can see of phenology. And all of you can make these kinds of phenology observations also, and you can contribute to scientific investigations of climate change. So one thing that you can do is just simply to keep a journal, a record of what's happening around your home or around in parks in Newton or elsewhere. So if you just keep a record of when you see the forsythia flowering in your yard or in your neighborhood, or when you see crab apples flowering, or when you see the peach trees flowering in Newton Center. So if you start keeping records of these things in a journal, that after just a few years, you'll have valuable information and you will have evidence yourself of climate change. So you will be more convincing of the reality of climate change if you have your own observations, which you make yourself. And the other thing you can do is you can contribute observations to national efforts to monitor phenology. So projects like Journey North, Project Budburst, also eBird for making observations of bird phenology. You can contribute these to national online databases, and this will really help scientists to keep track of changing phenology. The other thing you can do is if you're interested in climate change is to join a political group. I mean, the evidence of climate change that you can see around you will hopefully convince you that there's really a need to take a strong action against the growing threat of climate change. And joining a political party, the Party, the Republican Party, or joining groups like the Audubon Society, the Appalachian Mountain Club, will help you to take your own concerns and make make a group effort to try to change the mind of the politicians and our government. And the other thing you can do is change how you live, both as an individual and then getting people to change how they live in Newton or in Massachusetts or across the United States. So obviously, we want to deal with climate change by producing less greenhouse gases, having a simpler life, having a smaller car or no car, using more public transportation, living in a smaller house, using less electricity or less energy in our house, having a simpler diet. All these things are really important. Again, we need to do it as individuals, but also as a society. So again, we come back to Thoreau. So Thoreau, with his records, he gave us a rolometer for measuring climate change, and we certainly were able to detect the fingerprint of climate change by matching Thoreau's records against modern observations. But Thoreau would tell us not to stop there because Thoreau believed in taking action. And in Thoreau's life, he took very strong stands against the uh, problems of his time. He took very strong stands against war. He took very strong stands against slavery. And if he was alive today, he would tell us that we need to take strong actions to deal with the problems of climate change. And so I always come back to his book, Walden. And in the book Walden, Thoreau really has three main themes, which I think are all very relevant to the issue of climate change. So Thoreau tells us we should observe nature carefully. And he said we should observe nature carefully because we will get very valuable life lessons. But if you observe nature carefully, you will see the effects of climate change. The other thing he tells us in the book Walden is to live simply. And he tells us to live simply because if we live simply, we'll be healthier and happier. And also, we won't have to work as hard and we can spend more time studying nature and studying philosophy. But living simply, both as individuals and as society, is really the key to producing less greenhouse gases and dealing with the threat of climate change. And the third theme of his book is that we should stand up against injustice and we should try to affect society in a positive way. And again, in his time, he took strong stands against slavery and strong stands against war. We still have slavery in the world today, and we need to take actions against that. We still have slavery and injustice. We still have war, and we need to take strong stands against war. But if Thoreau was alive today, he would tell us that we also need to take strong stands against climate change. And if we use phenology as a way of studying the effects of climate change on natural systems, we will get evidence that we will see ourselves and that we've developed ourselves, and this will make us even stronger advocates for dealing with the problems of climate change. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Richard. That was wonderful. It was fascinating, concerning, and terrifying at the same time. But you've given us inspiration to observe and live safely and try to affect society. So thank you. Let's think about some questions. I want to go back to the very beginning where you showed us what was happening, what's likely to happen, and how agriculture is going to be affected. And I saw discussion of that map at one point, and I saw that someone had reacted and said, okay, so we may not be able to grow so many things here, but look, if you go way, way up north in Canada, they're going to have warmer temperatures and it's going to be great. But the comment I saw at that time was, in fact, it won't be equivalent, even though there may be area up there, because the length of their days and their seasons is different. Is that true?
Well, I think we don't know what the reality will be. I mean, we're seeing such massive changes that we don't know exactly whether they will be able to compensate. Also, they won't have the infrastructure there. So the climate might be suitable for growing wheat, for example, further north or corn further north, but there presently aren't the farms there that can really handle this. There isn't the infrastructure that can handle this. And then also that's not where the people are living. So, I mean, you have, a billion people living in India, and they're not going to be able to grow their crops, and they're poor, and they're not going to be able to go to Canada to have farms there. So the people in India are going to be desperately hungry and poor and starving, and the fact that there might be more wheat in Canada won't really help them.
Okay. Now I'm even more depressed. Thank you for answering
Well,
that.
it's a depressing situation, but I also believe that people are very adaptable, and people will adapt when they're forced to adapt. And I think that when the situation gets that serious, that I think that the human species will eventually start figuring out solutions to these things. And it will be easier to do it if we started sooner rather than later. So if climate change is only, if it only goes up by 2 degrees, we'll have a better chance of dealing with it. And if it goes up by 3 degrees centigrade, then I think we still will be able to deal with it, but we'll have a lot of hardships in the process.
I have another question about the early charts. So were Thoreau and Hosmer were they contemporaries?
Um, Hosmer knew Thoreau when Thoreau was sort of an older man or middle-aged man, that he knew Hosmer as a boy, and they often sometimes went out together for walks. So Hosmer knew that Thoreau was doing this, and Hosmer was using exactly the same methods as Thoreau. So he learned to do it from Thoreau, and he continued it. But Hosmer didn't describe very much what he was doing. He kept these records. He kept beautiful records, and these records are deposited at the Concord Free Library. But in his records, he doesn't have any description about what he was doing or why he was doing it.
Okay. But that does explain some of the difference why their dates were different because they weren't doing it at exactly the same time. Hosmer was later, so that could be the explanation.
Right. So Thoreau was doing this between 1851 and 1858, and he stopped in 1858. And Hosmer didn't start until 1878. So Hosmer didn't start doing this until 20 years later. But he was again using the exact same methods and looking at the same species. He knew that Thoreau was doing this. And he just thought it was just probably a good thing to do, or it was just continuing the tradition of Thoreau, but they certainly weren't doing it because of climate change. The reason that Thoreau was doing this is that Thoreau wanted to better understand the seasons, and he recognized that things happened earlier in warm years and later in cold years. So it was more, he was doing it for a pure phenological study. People at that time were recording phenology in a serious way, but they were mostly doing it as a way of understanding agriculture. They were using phenology as an indication of when to plant things.
Fascinating. I did, oh, maybe 20 years ago, have a chance to do some work at Native Plant Trust in their herbarium samples, but I don't remember for the life of me why they had them and people were keeping them. Um, would it have been, copying Thoreau at the time? Do you
And
know?
why they were recording phenology?
Yeah, why they had, I mean, they had incredible, dried samples of all the plants over time.
Why they had herbarium specimens? Right. So people keep herbarium specimens because it helps people to keep a record of what plants were occurring in a place. It helps people to um, keep records of floras, of doing studies of individual species. So there's a lot of value to keeping museum specimens, and now they're really being repurposed for climate change research. And this has actually proved to be a very important outcome for people who in museums, because before they were really focusing just on identification and classification of plants, and now herbarium specimens all over the world are being used in climate change research, and people who run museums are very happy about this.
That is really neat. Now, you did to lead into one of our audience questions. You talked about the difference between trees and wildflowers and how the trees rather, are more responsive than the wildflowers. Has anyone done studies about the difference between natives and exotics and whether one of them is more responsive?
That's right. So that The non-native, we've done studies in Concord with that thing because we're looking at the phenology of all the species in Concord. And what we find is that the non-native species tend to be more responsive to climate change than the native species. And that's actually one of the reasons why the non-native species are actually increasing in relative abundance in comparison to the native species. So in general, the native species are declining in Concord, and the non-native species, there's more species, and the species that are there are getting more common. And part of it seems to be related to the fact that they're more responsive to climate change. And this is particularly true in shrubs. So when you look at the shrubs in Concord, the native shrubs and the non-native shrubs, that the non-native shrubs leaf out earlier in the spring than the native shrubs, and they hold their leaves longer in the autumn than the native shrubs. And you can see this in Newton very well. So if you go to Newton, the earliest shrubs leafing out in the spring are things like honeysuckles and euonymus and buckthorn. Uh, Things like barberry and multiflora rose, they're leafing out earlier in the spring, and they often keep their leaves later in the fall. So if you go out now and you walk in the Webster Woods, I mean, the shrubs that still have their leaves are mostly the non-native shrubs. And it's thought that this altered phenology, the leafing phenology of the shrubs, is really what gives the non-native species their advantage. They have a longer growing season.
Now, I always thought that that was specifically because those were the seasons that they had in the geographic regions from which they came. And so that that's what they were doing here. But could it be that the ones that are succeeding here are just different in their nature of how they respond to temperature and light? Well,
Well,
like
they're all responding to the same cues. So they're all responding to how long the winter is. So they have a certain way of judging the length of the winter. It's called the winter chilling requirement. Then they respond to day length, and then they also respond to the temperatures in the spring. And these shrubs, which are coming from Europe and Asia, the climate there is more predictable. And so the species respond to spring temperature very readily. Actually, say they respond to day length, in particular, probably more strongly, because that's a reliable indicator of when spring is. But in the case of New England, the weather is so variable from year to year that plants really require a lot of warm temperatures before they start leafing out in the spring and don't respond as strongly to day length. And so in Europe, again, the species leaf out earlier in the same temperature conditions than than they do in this region. So trees in Europe, the weather is more reliable, and the trees and shrubs respond to that by leafing out earlier in the spring.
okay, I had written down a question at the time you said it about why the temperature is more important in New England than it is in other areas. And so you're saying that's because we are more variable and they've had to adapt, they had to evolve over time.
That's right. So what happens in New England, we sometimes have these warm days very early in the spring, followed by very cold days. We just have this very variable weather. And so trees and shrubs and wildflowers in this region have adapted to that by needing a lot more warm temperatures to accumulate, I mean, over the course of days or over the course of weeks and maybe a month before they start leafing out and flowering. In the contrast, in Europe and Asia, the climate is much less variable. And so the trees and shrubs are much more liable to take advantage of day length before they start using day length as a cue for flowering and leafing out.
Fascinating. We have another question about leaf out, which is that if trees leaf out earlier than wildflowers, are the wildflowers shaded out?
Well, this is actually sensitivity to temperature. So we're saying the trees are more sensitive to temperature than wildflowers. But most of the spring wildflowers actually leaf out a couple of, or about a month, anywhere from a couple of weeks to a month before the trees leaf out. And so what's happening is that because of the fact that trees are more sensitive to climate change than wildflowers, that window of full light hitting the forest floor in late March and April is actually seems to be getting narrower. So the wildflowers are still leafing out before the trees leaf out, but that several week period when there's full sunlight hitting the forest floor is actually getting shorter. And that's what we call a phenological mismatch. In this case, a mismatch between trees and wildflowers.
Okay. You had talked about when you talked about the phenological mismatch. You had talked about how it's very hard to find information on insects. And so I wondered in that to-do list for us, should we start figuring out, taking photos, seeing when we see the first insects come in the spring as well?
That's right. So that would be a great thing to do. And actually, one thing which I forgot to mention is the use of iNaturalist. So iNaturalist has proved to be this extremely valuable way that people can contribute photographs and make them available to the scientific community. So people use iNaturalist to take photographs or similar apps where they take photographs of things and then they're able to identify the iNaturalist app is able to identify the insect and then the photograph goes into the iNaturalist database. And so this is really allowing um, scientists for the first time to have very large databases of photographs of insects, which they can use in phenological research. So this represents a potential breakthrough. But I should also mention that this topic of phenological mismatch between, say, plants and insects and birds is something that scientists are very fascinated with, the general public is very fascinated with, but it's actually very hard to get information about it. So scientists are working on it very actively, and the number of really good examples is actually very small.
Why?
It's because it's very hard to see what birds are eating and get good information about what birds are eating. So birds, we know they're eating insects generally, but it's hard to actually watch birds and see what they're eating. And the only way to do it is to sort of catch the birds and then get them to throw up what they're eating or look at the bird droppings. And then you're only getting kind of one small snapshot in time. But really, what you would want to know is what birds are eating over the course of several weeks or several months while they're laying their eggs and feeding their chicks. And it's very hard to get that information for more than just a few birds. It's a very difficult system to work on, actually, to investigate, to determine precisely what birds are eating over a long period of time.
So that's a real challenge that needs to be worked out.
Well, it's a challenge that many people have identified. They've identified that phenological mismatch is an important topic, but it's very hard to investigate it in practice, particularly for birds and insects.
We have another bird question, which is if birds are staying longer due to the warmer falls, will they learn to come earlier in the spring?
Um, I mean, they are arriving a little bit earlier in the spring, but this problem for migratory birds is that they're starting off um, from their overwintering habitat in places like South America, from Central America, from the Caribbean. They don't know what the climate is like in New England. They don't know if things are changing here. So they basically start migrating north at pretty much the same time in response to day length or in response to rainfall patterns. So they're migrating north probably at around the same time. And and then they just start flying north. And if it's very, very warm and the conditions are very good, if the trees are leafing out where they are, say in the southeastern United States, they keep migrating north. But if it's very rainy, if it's very windy, they don't fly, and so that really tends to delay their arrival time here. So there's a lot of factors which affect when they arrive in New England, and so even if it's a warm year, they're not responding as fast as the trees and the wildflowers and the insects because those species are here already and they're responding to the climates of New England. But birds, when they migrate, they're just responding to a lot of other factors. One thing which might happen is that over the course of many generations, maybe even dozens of generations of birds, that they will gradually evolve to leave earlier from their overwintering grounds. But that's probably not happening yet.
Fascinating. We won't be around to make those records. Oh, well, we just got to make sure to keep telling other people to do it.
That's right. Well, I mean, a lot of these records are going to be kept by, future generations of people living in the United States and around the world, and they will see a lot of changes. I mean, but of course, we've seen just huge changes in 20 years. So just in 20 years, I mean, I've seen enormous changes in the floor of Newton and the floor of Concord. So, I mean, these changes happen surprisingly fast. But they certainly for young people, so people who are in the Newton schools now, I mean, if they stay living in Newton, they will see enormous changes in their lifetime.
We have a question from one of our board members saying, have most birds been able to cope with the changes in the earlier leafing out of trees, flowers flowering, and insects?
Um, it depends on the individual species and where in the United States we're talking about or where in the world we're talking about. But there are certainly many places where climate change has demonstrated to have a really serious negative impact on birds. So, for example, California, the birds have been studied very intensively. And in Southern California, the climate has just gotten warmer to the point where many birds are really not able to survive as well or not able to fledge their young as well because of very high temperatures and lack of water in those areas. So we know that climate change is already affecting those species in a major way. We know that climate change is causing many bird species to extend their range further north in eastern North America. So a lot of birds are found much further north now than they were several decades ago. So I think that some might cope and some might not. So when we have extreme drought conditions like we had this summer in New England, especially in places like Canada, excuse me, places like Maine, that many bird species won't be able to cope. About 6 years ago, we had a terrible drought in Massachusetts, and during that drought, I remember that there were almost no birds in the forest. That the birds basically all left this region because it was just too dry, and also there weren't very many insects to eat. There wasn't much fruit, and so all the insects wound up just leaving. Actually, all the birds just wound up just leaving.
And clearly, the loss of birds throughout the world is just birds and insects both. It's just phenomenal. It's figuring out why and what, right?
Right. So, I mean, this has been a lecture about climate change, but there's also, I mean, many other major concerns of biologists. And one of them that you mentioned is just the loss of insects. And, this has been very evident in my life that there's fewer insects now than there were when I was growing up. We did a survey of the flower visiting insects in Newton. A few years ago, we spent 2 years looking at insects in Newton and what flowers they visited. And it was very striking. There were almost no butterflies. We saw almost no butterflies over the course of the summer in Newton. I mean, we saw some, but extremely few butterflies given the amount of time we were observing in Newton. And this is just kind of, a specific example of the lack of insects. My wife is very active gardener, and there's many times when it's a sunny day in April, and there's just no insects visiting the flowers in her garden. So she actually goes through the garden and she hand pollinates a lot of the flowers herself, a lot of the blueberry flowers and peach flowers and apple blossoms. She hands pollinates them because she's just not seeing any bumblebees or honeybees visiting the flowers. And, there's probably a lot of causes of that, but I think that certainly one of the largest causes of it is the fact that there's just so much herbicides and pesticides being used in Newton that this is probably one of the main contributors to the decline of insect populations in this region. I mean, if you go to the garden supply stores in Newton and the surrounding areas, that it's just astonishing how much herbicides and pesticides and fungicides and miticides are being sold in the stores.
And used in my neighbor's yards all the time. I've go, no. And over the past 5 years, I know in my yard, the loss of butterflies in particular has just been unbelievable.
Right. Yes, I mean, it's a very serious problem.
So we have another person saying temperature, precipitation timing, day length, and even perhaps wind are climate change related factors. How do you weigh the weight of each in affecting species flowering?
Well, it depends on the region, but in New England, it's almost exclusively temperature which is driving spring flowering times. In other parts of the country, it's different. So in many other parts of the country, plants flower in response to winter rains or spring rains. But in New England, it's always wet in the spring. So there's always moisture in the ground in the spring because all the snow is melting, the ice is melting, and so there's always water in the soil in the spring. There's always humidity in the air. Moisture is not limiting in the spring. Where where it other factors are important is probably during the summertime. So during the summertime, plants are flowering, not so much in relationship to temperature, but in relationship to day length. So many species in the summertime and the autumn flower in relationship to day length. And also the length of the flowering is relating to the amount of moisture. So if it's a very dry summer, then many plant species will flower very briefly in the summer. And if we look this time of the year, if we look at things like goldenrods or asters, which are flowering in our fields, that if it's a very mild and wet autumn, that asters and goldenrods will keep flowering up until the time of the first frost. But if it's a very hot and very, very dry autumn, then those goldenrods and asters will just stop flowering because they just don't have enough moisture to actually keep the flowers open.
Please. So you talked about how we are losing plants at the southern edge, but aren't we also, for example, we're starting to lose our maples, right? Because they need the colder temperature. I think I may have read that. And so they're moving north. Um,
That's right.
so
So yes, go ahead.
there's got to be some that we're losing going up too.
That's right. So there's a lot of threats to our tree species right now in Newton and elsewhere. And so for many species, it's just getting too hot for them, like sugar maples will be, it's getting kind of too hot for them in New England, or things like spruces and firs. It's just getting too hot and too dry in the summer. Well, it's getting too hot for them in the summertime. There's also a lot of species which are being attacked by new pests, as many of you know. So, for example, the emerald ash borer is killing all of our ash trees. The woolly adelgid is killing the hemlock trees. And just recently, or just in the last year and a half, we've had a new beech disease come in, beech leaf disease, which is killing all the beech trees. And some of these are just associated with new pests coming in from other places on agricultural stock or species spreading. But a lot of it has to do with climate change also, because climate change often really creates novel conditions, warmer conditions, stressed conditions for plants, which make them much more susceptible to these kinds of new pests. A little bit of a depressing topic to end with, right?
Oh, and
I mean,
we got a
I
couple.
mean, I would say if we want to make a topic, an ending which is not so depressing, I would say that we live in very challenging times. There's a lot of threats and problems caused by climate change, but it's also, in a way, it's kind of an exciting time because we're seeing change in front of us. It's not a boring time. We're seeing a lot of systems change. They're really being altered by climate change, especially phenology. Phenology is changing quite dramatically as the conditions get warmer, as rainfall patterns change. And it's a time when we can make a difference. It's a time when we can do something. And especially groups like Newton Conservators can make recommendations to the city and help to promote solutions, which then people in Newton and really around Massachusetts can then implement. So it's a time when we really can make a difference. It's not a boring time.
Well, that is one of my two last not pressing questions. And I liked what you told us about making a difference. And when we get this information, when we record it, where we should report it. So I have Journey North, which I wasn't aware of before that you mentioned, and Budburst and eBird, and you mentioned the Audubon Society and AMC. So are those, if I just go and look them up, I will probably be able to find a place that I can share with the people who are watching this where they can make reports?
Yeah,
Or,
sure. You can find all those places. Again, Journey North is for mostly for butterflies, but other things. Um, Project Budburst is mostly for plants. Um, and then they have actually other websites which are very suitable for more for children or for school groups. They also, and again, eBird for birds. There's also the Massachusetts Butterfly Society, which is taking observations of butterflies. And again, kind of just taking photographs with a smartphone and loading them into iNaturalist is also very valuable. And it's a good way to learn to identify things.
and I've noticed when I do this, other groups will come and they'll pick up my photos and put them with their collections of similar items. And I know John Regeson, for example, has some going of specific areas where I think Cold Spring Park is one of them, where when you record what you've seen there, it gets put into the collection to look at just for
That's
that.
right. There's all sorts of things that are done with iNaturalist photographs, but one of the most valuable is that if you join a group for a particular region, like Cold Spring Park, I mean, you contribute your observations, and then it goes into a master list of all the species which have been seen in Cold Spring Park. So it contributes to a database of what species are there and how abundant they are, and even where they are in the park.
We'll try to share that. I know, for example, a scout group has asked us if we'd come and do a talk and work with kids. And that would be really good information to share with them that they could do on an ongoing basis too. That
Right. Right.
take,
Again, I think that, I think someone like John Regeson, who uses iNaturalist, and I'm sure many other people in Newton use iNaturalist quite a lot, and then, showing people how to use it and then look at the observations.
yeah, and he's done some bio blitzes where he takes people out and they as a group make observations and then he shows them how to use iNaturalist. So that will
Right.
be a good way to do what you suggest. Now, my last question is really simple, and I could look it up, but I want us all to share in it. How do you spell realometer?
Um,
Is it
yeah,
Realome?
Realometer.
Okay.
And again, I mean, Thoreau has this reputation of being kind of a cranky old man, of kind of this kind of difficult person. Um, and it's just very curious that people sort of think of him that way. He was actually had a lot of friends. He was an extremely social person. He had a very rich family life. And he was also a very funny guy. I mean, he really his book Walden is really just full of funny stories and jokes and making up words. Everybody should read Walden or read it again.
I was a graduate student, we don't want to years ago. I'm going to go back and reread it. That's an assignment for all of us, everybody.
Well, there was actually one time a couple of years ago when I was writing my popular book Walden Warming, where I read the book Walden I think four times in 2 months.
Wow. Okay. I don't know that we'll equal that, but we'll.
Right.
Well, thank you, Richard. This was fascinating and sobering and inspirational all at the same time. If folks would like to have, if you think of questions going forward that you'd like to ask, you can send them to Professor Primack through webinars at newconservators.org. And Richard is on the board of advisors for Newton Conservators, so will be very easy for us to get your questions to him. And this has been just wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard. And good night, everyone.